Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to paint this gorgeous mini watercolor daisy bouquet. I'll share the entire process with you step by step, so grab your supplies and let's get into it. As always, the supplies I'm using in this video are linked below in the description box. Now, I'm going to be painting with a 3x4 inch small sheet of paper. So if you want to paint larger, you definitely can. I just wanted to paint this one in a mini format to make it a little more approachable and beginner friendly. I do have another daisy tutorial I'll link above if you want to practice painting normal sized daisies, but I'm keeping it small for this video. Now, anytime I'm painting bouquets like this, I always like to start by just penciling in the direction of each of the stems. And for this painting, we're going to have 4 daisies. So that means 4 little lines. I'm not sketching out anything crazy. I'm not actually sketching out the flowers. I'm just penciling in where I want each of these stems to go so I can make sure I like the direction and the balance of the composition. So I'm grabbing my pencil and I'm going to start with the tallest daisy first. And I want that one to be curving up towards the top right. So I'm starting here at the bottom and I'm just making this stem have a gentle curve up towards the top. And I want to have room to paint my daisy here, so I'm not going to draw it too tall, but I'm stopping right about here. The second tallest daisy will be to the left of that one. Let's see, I think I want it to start about here. I'm going to have it overlapping that first stem and just coming down like that. I want to have another one that is a little bit droopy on the right side. So I'm pulling it up and having it curve down like that. And let's have one more little guy coming down from the left and overlapping right here in the middle. If you want to add more stems, you absolutely can. If you want to have them going in different directions, by all means, you're welcome to do that. But again, I just like to start with a simple stem sketch before I start painting. Now I'm going to bring you in a bit closer. Since we're painting small, I want you to be able to see all of the brush strokes. I'm using a size 4 brush and I'm going to start with just a basic cadmium yellow deep, and I'm using a light value so it's pretty watered down. And I'm going to start by just painting in the center of my left daisy. Now this one's going to be a pretty straight on view of the daisy, so I'm just going to paint a simple little oval for the center of it. I'm keeping it nice and small and I'm just going to put down my first wash. So you can see it's just a basic oval shape. And while it's still wet, I'm going to grab a little bit of a darker value. That means it's more concentrated. And I'm adding a little bit of a permanent red to make this more of an orangey tone. And while it's still wet, I'm going to tap in a little bit of this around the edges to give the daisy a little bit of depth. So I'm just gently tapping it in. And because that first layer was still wet, the darker orange, it's almost like a burnt orange, is seeping in and just creating a nice little shadow around the bottom of this shape. And because we're painting in the mini style, I am using a size 4 brush, but I'm only using the very tip of it when I paint these things. So I'm keeping my strokes nice and small and just practicing my control using just the tip of the brush. And before that dries completely, I want to do one final step by just adding the tiniest little bit of raw umber around the very edge to deepen that shadow even more. Again, I'm not going super detailed with these paintings, but I do want to have a sense of contrast and depth to really make the center of these daisies stand out. So I'm using raw umber, I'm using the very tip of my brush and just gently tapping it down to create these tiny little strokes around the outer edge. So that's it for the center of this first daisy. You can see adding those layers really helped bring it to life. It's not just one flat shade of yellow. We have the lighter for the highlight, we have a darker orange, and then the dark brown as it reaches the bottom. So let's go ahead and let that dry and then we'll paint the petals. For my petals, I'm going to be using Payne's Gray, but I'm using the lightest value I can possibly do. So you can see here on my palette, this is my Payne's Gray, and I've just added a lot of water to it, so it's a super, super light value. And one of the defining characteristics of daisies and the way that I like to paint them is to give them really rounded petals. So if you've watched my other tutorials, sometimes I like to have my flower petals with sharp points, but for daisies, I always make them nice and round. So I have my paint loaded up, and to create this petal, I'm going to use the tip of my brush, pull out a little line, push down, make this petal nice and long, and then I kind of curve my brush inwards to create the rounded edge. And I'm going to do one more stroke right next to it, pulling out, and then connecting up there at the top. I have a little too much water, so just going to soak that up. But you can see that petal is nice and rounded, so it's curved. And we will add a little bit of detail to these petals once they dry, but for now I'm going to just work my way around, creating these daisy petals. So pulling out using the tip of my brush, pushing down, rounding that curve, and doing the same thing right next to it. And as I work my way around, I want to kind of vary the value. So some of them will be slightly darker, some will be a little bit lighter. And I do actually usually paint my daisy petals a little bit lighter than this, but I wanted you to be able to see it on screen. Sometimes if I work with super light values, it's hard to pick up on video, so feel free to go a little bit lighter than I am doing if you want. But we're just going to continue making our way around. And for this one, since it's a pretty straight on view, all my petals will be relatively the same size, and they're all going to be coming straight out from that center. As we add more flowers to this little bouquet, we're going to have some different perspectives, but for this one, just go ahead and add your petals all the way around. All right, so first daisy is looking good. As I said, we will add a little bit of texture to the petals, but I want to make sure that dries completely. So that step is going to be a little further down the road. Next up though, we're going to paint our side view, kind of drooping daisy, and that one is the tallest one in this top right corner. And since this one is a little bit more of a side droopy perspective, instead of painting this oval like we did for the first one, we're going to paint kind of a mound. So it's going to be rounded on the top, like that. You can see it's almost like a little upside down U shape, and then a flatter bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that in with my cadmium yellow deep. And we're going to do just like we did on the first one, where we add a little bit of depth to it by first going in with more of a reddish yellow orange mixture. So that's my cadmium yellow deep with a little bit of permanent red. And again, utilizing that wet on wet technique. So because that first layer is still wet, when I go in to add this darker layer, it blends with it and creates a beautiful blend. Now I want the shadow only to be on this bottom edge. So unlike the first daisy where we did it all the way around, I'm just concentrating my shadows on the very bottom. And that's going to help give it that depth. So we have the highlight up at the top, and then it gets darker towards the bottom. And just like we did on the previous flower, I'm using a little bit of raw umber and just carefully tapping down that dark brown at the very bottom. I don't want the brown to overpower the yellow, I just want it to really add to that contrast and depth. So just really carefully tapping that in. While this dries, I'm going to go back to our first daisy and just add that little bit of texture that I mentioned. So I'm grabbing a slightly darker value of my Payne's Gray. Darker value just means it's a little bit more concentrated, but not too dark. And I'm going to make sure my brush is fairly dry. It's going to have plenty of color on it, but because I want these little texture lines to be super dainty and super delicate, I want to make sure that I don't have too much paint and water loaded up into my brush. So tap it on your paper towel before you do this part and just use the very tip of your brush to create little wispy strokes. I usually do just a few lines per petal, but you can see it just adds the littlest bit of texture and brings these daisy petals to life. So I'm just kind of flicking my wrist as I do this. Again, it's just a slightly darker value. It's not overpowering, it's not super contrasting, but it just adds that little bit of texture. So just adding a few. They're not all uniform, so some of these lines are a little bit shorter, some are a little bit longer. And I'm just going to go ahead and do that to all of these petals. And as I said, you want to make sure that first layer is completely dry before you do this. If any of these petals were still wet and I tried to go in and add these texture lines, it would just bleed out and not be these crisp little detail lines. It would bleed out into that first layer. So you always want to make sure if you're doing details like this, that that first layer is dry. So there we go. It's a subtle little detail, but it really helps bring those flower petals to life, and it matches the level of detail of the center of the daisy. And now we can start adding the petals for our droopy daisy. So what's going to be different about these is the bottom petals are still going to pull down just like we did in this one. As we work our way towards the side, first of all, they're going to stop right about here, and the side petals are going to really have a curve to them. So let's start with the bottom petals because those ones are the easiest. They're very similar to what we just did. I'm going to pull down, push and lift back up. I'm actually going to make that just slightly darker so you can see it better. Pushing down and doing the same thing right next to it to create just a basic petal coming down. Let's do another one next to it. Same thing, pulling down, creating that curved petal shape. And you can see that one next to it already started to have a little bit of a curve. So the next one's going to be slightly shorter and slightly curvier. So I'm just curving my brush stroke down. It's still going to have a rounded edge, but you can see it's starting to create kind of a rounded, droopy side view daisy. And let's do one more here on the side. I'm making this one very short. And that's all we're going to do. So we'll do the same thing on this left side too. Loading up a little more of that Payne's Gray in my brush. The one directly to the left's not going to be too curved, but it'll start to have a little bit of a curve. Make sure that edge is nice and rounded. And that value is actually a little darker than I would like, so I'm just going to soak up a little bit of the pigment to lighten it. And then I'll add one or two more here on the side. And you'll notice I'm twisting my paper as I do this. That just helps me in the way that I position my hands. If you prefer to keep it like this, that's totally fine, but I like to pull my petals away from the center of the flower, so I just turn it as I add these side petals. Let's add one or two more. Pulling out the little thin part and then curving my petal, creating that rounded edge. And let's do one more little guy coming up on the side. Okay, so now we have our two flowers done, and you can already see that this bouquet is shaping up to have a lot of dimension. It's going to look interesting. We're not just having straight on flowers with simple stems coming out. We're gonna have some curved, we're gonna have the drooping petals. And this one that we're going to do last is going to be a back view daisy, and those ones can be a little bit tricky. So I'm actually gonna do this left side one first, and then we'll finish off on the back side daisy. Now, another reason why I start in pencil for at least where I want to place the stems is so that I have room to change my mind or to change the composition as I go. So my initial stem that I had penciled in here would have the flower right here, and that would just butt up a little too close to that first daisy that we painted. So good thing we did it in pencil. I'm gonna just make this one a little more curved and a little lower so that it has room for the petals. Okay, so I just made it a little lower and a little more to the left. I'm going to go through this one a little bit faster because it's going to basically be the same daisy as we did first, but just a little bit smaller. So again, for the center, I start with my light value of yellow, and while that is still wet, I go in with a slightly darker value and just tap in a little shadow along the edge. And then I add my final little touches of dark brown for the darkest shadow. While that center dries, let's do the same thing and add some texture onto the droopy petals. So again, my brush is fairly dry, but I have a darker value of my Payne's Gray, and I'm just going to carefully add in these little dainty texture lines. So using a flicking motion and adding these in the same direction. So on the curved petals, my lines are also going to be slightly curved. And I just add a couple per petal. As I said, this daisy on the far left is going to be very similar to this one, just a little bit smaller. So same process, pulling out my petals, making sure that base layer is nice and even. If it butts up next to that other one, it's totally fine. It's going to help our bouquet look a little bit more natural and full. But I'm just going to add all of these petals. They're slightly smaller. Just adding them in all the way around this daisy. Okay, so while those petals dry, again, we need to make sure they're fully dry before we add the texture on top. We're going to get started with this back view daisy. And as I said, it's a little bit trickier. Let me show you my practice painting that I did here, just so you can get an idea of what it will look like. It's aiming the other way. So if you were to pick up this bouquet, some flowers in a normal bouquet would be kind of drooping to the side like this. Some would be going straight up and down. Some might be facing another direction. And I like to add these in, again, just to give a little bit more of a dynamic feel to our composition. We're still going to have petals kind of coming up towards that way, but it's going to be the flip-flop of this one. So for this side view, we had petals coming on the bottom, but none on the top. On this one, we're going to have the top petals coming and none on the bottom. We're also not going to have a center, because if you were to look at this flower in real life, the center is hidden behind these back petals. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to pencil in where I want these little spikes or the backside of the stem to be, and then I'm going to paint my petals in between them. So see how this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, kind of 6 coming off the end, and then each petal is in between those. So first I'm going to take my pencil again and just start sketching out the little spindly parts of the back side of the daisy. So first we have the stem coming this way. It's really drooping off to the side. I'm going to create kind of a U shape coming off of the stem. So see, it's almost like a little goblet cup coming off like that. And then I'm just going to very loosely sketch out these little spikes coming off. And they don't need to be perfect. We're going to go over them with a dark green once we do the finishing details, but for now I just want to be able to know where I can paint the petals, which again is going to be in between all of these. So for now I'm just adding these little legs coming off of the stem. And again, since this daisy doesn't have a center, we don't need to worry about painting any of the yellow parts. We can just dive straight into the petals. So I have my Payne's Gray loaded up. So my petals will be pretty much the same. It's the same rounded shape, but this is the back side of the daisy petals. So I'm making it a little bit darker, and I'm just going to add these petals in between. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. We can always make adjustments once we go in with our green paint. But for now, just adding in these little petals in between where I penciled in the green parts. So let's go ahead and let this dry. As it dries, we can go back and add our texture onto this one. I'm just checking with my finger to make sure that first layer is totally dry, which it is. So using the tip of my brush, I'm careful not to touch these ones because they're still wet, but just making those little dainty lines for the texture. So let's let everything dry for now, and then we'll go in, add the texture onto the back side of these petals, and then start adding in the stem, the back part of this daisy, and that will really help bring this whole piece to life. So take a breather, let everything dry, and then we'll come back. Everything is dry, so first things first, I'm gonna add the texture onto the back side of these petals. Super subtle, just gonna quickly flick on these strokes, and then we will put away the Payne's Gray and move on to the stem. So for my stem, I'm going to be using a mixture of deep sap green and a little bit of raw umber to desaturate it. And first things first, I'm just going to paint in the stems. I'm not going to worry about this backside. I'm not going to worry about adding leaves yet. I just want to start building in the color for each of the stems. So I'm using the very tip of my brush. Some of these will be overlapping, but I just want to make sure when I add these that I'm not overlapping the petals. So the stems are always going to be behind the petals. So let's start with this one on the top left. You'll just see it peeking out there. And then it's going to come down and get slightly thicker at the bottom. There's nothing too crazy or too complex about these stems. I'm going to get a little more color on my brush. And now I'll do this one. Using the tip of my brush and pulling it down. Our tall daisy is going to have the most overlapping or underlapping, I should say. So I just am going to be very careful with this. I'm fine with it overlapping other stems. I just don't want it overlapping those petals because that just wouldn't wouldn't make very much sense perspective-wise. So I'm pulling it up. It's going to go behind that stem, behind that petal. It's going to peek out in between those two petals, and then come up to meet the daisy right there. But it's looking good so far. And now we can do the back side of this daisy. Like I said, this one can be a little bit tricky, so take your time with it. I'm gonna start the same way. So starting just by using the tip of my brush. It's gonna go behind these stems. And just keeping, I'm not applying a whole lot of pressure here. I'm keeping my strokes very light and delicate. And I'm gonna start by just placing in some green here, just tapping down my brush to kind of fill out that area a little bit more. And once you have that, we're just gonna go over the top with these little green lines. So I'm using the tip of my brush here. It gets skinnier on the outer edges and then thicker as it meets with the base of the green. And we're going in between each petal. So starting with the tip of my brush, getting a little bit thicker as it meets the rest of the green. Same thing here. Again, I'm twisting my paper just because it's a little bit easier. So I apologize if it's making anyone dizzy, but starting dainty at the very outer edge and then meeting in here in the middle. So they almost look like just little spikes. I'll see if I can do the last two upright so I don't make anyone dizzy with all my paper spinning, but starting in between, nice and thin, and then getting a little thicker right there. And you can really start to see this perspective show up, that we're looking at the back side of this daisy. I'm gonna have one more little guy coming off here, maybe one more here too. Okay, so as I said, these can be a little bit tricky and perspective-wise can be difficult. Since it's a little bit different than the rest of these, we're looking at the back side. So I'm just gonna make some minor adjustments to mine here. Of course, yours will look slightly different than mine. And you don't wanna overdo it, but there you go. So now you can tell that that one daisy is facing the opposite direction. I'm gonna darken the rest of the stems. Again, I like to just start with that first layer of color to make sure everything's looking good, make sure all the stems are in the correct areas, but as you can see, this one's quite a bit darker, so I'm going to darken the rest of the stems, just using a darker value, a light hand, and just gently going over that. And now we can add in some leaves. Now you don't have to add in any more leaves. If you're happy with how it is, that's great. I just can't resist adding leaves to all of my pieces. I'm sure if you've seen my other tutorials, you already know that about me, but I don't want to overdo it. This is already a pretty busy bouquet with 4 different flowers and different perspectives, but I do just want to add a little bit to really fill it out. So first I see quite a bit of an open space here. Open space or white space is totally fine. You don't always have to fill it in, but I do think that could be a potential area to add a little leaf. So I'm going to have one coming off the top of this stem. So kind of similar to how we painted the petals. I start thin, push down, give a little of a curve to it, and then pull up. Do another one right next to it. I'm gonna have a dainty little guy coming off on the very bottom. And please feel free to add your leaves wherever you want. You don't need to do the same places that I am, but I just wanna kind of find those areas where it makes sense to add a little extra foliage. So I'm gonna have one coming up here, pulling up, adding a bit of movement to it, and maybe one little guy at the very bottom. And once these are mostly dry, I'm just going to add a little bit of extra detail using a darker value. Not making it too detailed, but just adding a little bit of texture to the leaves, just like we did with the petals. And with watercolor, you're always layering from light to dark, so keep that in mind. If you're going on top of a light value of color, you'll have to use a darker value. And there we go. That's gonna be it for today. I love how sweet and simple this bouquet turned out. And again, I just think that slightly different positioning of each flower keeps it looking interesting and dynamic. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you enjoyed it. And be sure to check out my other floral tutorials and classes for more painting fun. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.